In the year 1792, Britain has just come out of a war that has cost them not only much of their national treasury, but one of its most lucrative overseas colonies, North America. Other wars fought during this time had also cost them their access to their silver mines in South America, which had been helping fund much of their trade with the Qing dynasty of China. European traders all wanted greater access to China, but the emperor was wary of letting outsiders too far into his country and kept them all penned up in the port of Canton, which was strictly regulated by the Hong Business Group. A flourishing black market grew, but Britain wanted more. One trader, acting on his own initiative, grew bold enough to go to Beijing and attempt to get a hearing over his trade grievances, but the Chinese considered this a huge breach of protocol and an offense to the emperor. Britain had to do something, however. They imported over 10 million pounds of tea each year, equal to 10% of the government's annual spending, and the fact that China did not have anywhere near as great an interest in British products meant that they were running an enormous trade deficit they could no longer sustain. The Crown appointed an official envoy, Earl George Macartney, with orders to end the Canton system, establish an embassy, and acquire rights to an island that would be under British control in the same way that the Portuguese controlled Macau. The mission failed spectacularly. Although Macartney got permission to sail north and meet with the Qianlong Emperor in his southern palace in Johal, he refused to perform the traditional kowtow, which was required upon meeting the emperor. He presented gifts from the British court, but the Chinese interpreted these gifts as tribute, not trade enticements, and decided they had no need for nor interest in what he offered. Since he failed to get them to agree to any of his three requests, Britain wanted to find another way to address the trade imbalance with China. They had loaned huge amounts of monies to the Honorable East India Company to conquer India, and to pay their debts, the East India Company turned that land into poppy fields and manufactured opium in huge quantities. Since China had banned the opium trade, the East India Company set up a market in Calcutta, part of their Indian territory, and turned a blind eye to the black market traders who smuggled it into China. By 1839, over 6.6 million pounds of opium were being smuggled into China every year. The Chinese Daoguan Emperor appointed an upright official named Lin Zexu to halt the opium trade. Lin orchestrated a massive campaign to arrest opium traders, force addicts into rehab, and confiscate pipes. He even laid siege to the British warehouses when the merchants refused to turn over their opium supply, instead taking it all by force and burning it. The outraged merchants sought compensation from their government, but although the chief superintendent Charles Elliot promised them restitution, the government never had any intention of paying them back. Amid the unrest, 2 British sailors brutally murdered a Chinese man. Lin Zexu demanded their execution, but Elliot insisted on trying them aboard his ship and sentencing them himself. Lin Zexu had had enough. He halted the British food supply and ordered the Portuguese to eject them from Macau. They retreated to a barren island off the coast, now known as Hong Kong. Since the island could not support them, Elliot petitioned the Chinese to sell them food again. He received no response. Then he sent men to collect it directly, but on their way back they were halted by the Chinese Navy, and the first engagement of the Opium Wars began. The British responded to the Chinese halting their ships by erecting a blockade outside Canton. They fired a warning shot to turn back a British merchant ship, the Royal Saxon, which attempted a blockade run, and the Chinese sent out their own navy to defend the runner. They were demolished. The British had better ships and better firepower. They made to discuss a treaty, but the Chinese refused to give in to British demands regarding the ownership of Hong Kong. The British moved on to capture Kusan, an island near Shanghai. Then a rumor prompted them to believe that China planned to strike against them, so they acted preemptively and kicked off the Battle of Chuanpi. Again they won, but the slaughter was so horrifying that Superintendent Elliot was glad to seek a peace treaty with the emperor's envoy, Qishan. Finally, Qishan agreed to give up Hong Kong, to give the British better trade status, in exchange for which Britain returned the land they'd taken. But Elliot's supervisor back in London, Lord Palmerston, felt the treaty didn't go far enough, especially since it didn't re-establish opium trading rights. The emperor found Qishan's capitulation disgraceful, even threatened to have him hanged for it. What had looked like a moderate win for both sides suddenly threatened to fall apart. Disappointed in the treaty, the Daoguan Emperor replaced Qishan with 3 new commanders. One of them wanted to buy time and modernize the army, but the emperor insisted the British be repelled immediately. They assaulted Canton from across the river, firing cannons and sailing fire ships at the British fleet. Their efforts fell far short, and soon the British controlled the river again. The Chinese were forced to pay them an indemnity to leave Canton, but in their wake riots and looting plagued the city anyway. Elliot still led the British forces, but upon returning to Hong Kong, he learned that he was now being replaced. His replacements had no interest in the compromises he'd tried to establish. They then pushed immediately towards Beijing. In each new fort they captured, they found evidence that the Chinese resistance had ironically been weakened by crippling opium addiction. As the Chinese attacks grew more desperate, British retaliation grew more brutal. Finally, they stood ready to seize Nanking. With it would come control of the Yangtze River on which all of China depended, so the emperor was forced to negotiate. They had no bargaining power and gave the British nearly everything they wanted: a huge indemnity, new trade ports, no more Hong monopoly, generous tariffs, consulates, and sovereignty over Hong Kong. The only two matters they refused were Christian missionaries and the legalization of opium, but the latter would only lead to the Second Opium War with similar results. These unequal treaties would go down in Chinese history as the beginning of what the communist government later called the Century of Humiliation. The specter of this shame and forced subservience to European interest continues to shape politics today, as this history is often invoked or used as a rallying cry during dealings with the West.